In the autumn of 1919, in the high plains of Wyoming, where the land stretched unforgiving toward horizons that offered neither sympathy nor shelter, people riding past the Hollister homestead on the county road would slow their horses and stare. What they saw violated every assumption about what a woman alone could or should attempt. Margaret Hollister, a widow not yet 30, was digging a trench. Not a garden plot, which would have been expected. Not a root cellar, which would have been sensible. She was cutting a long, deep channel through earth that resisted the shovel like it resisted everything else connecting the north wall of her modest cabin to the south wall of her barn, a distance of 40 feet that might as well have been a chasm for all the scorn it would earn her. The work progressed with a rhythm that spoke of determination rather than experience. Meg moved earth with the steady persistence of someone who understood that stopping meant admitting defeat, and defeat meant her daughters would freeze. She pried stones loose with hands that had never held a shovel until 6 months ago, but had learned fast because there was no one else to do it. She marked lines with string, the way her husband had taught her to mark survey boundaries back when he'd been alive, to explain why precision mattered. The structure took shape slowly through September, and with each passing day, the consensus at the trading post hardened into certainty. Grief had finally broken Margaret Hollister's mind. They called it the widow's folly. At first, the name spoken with the particular mixture of pity and judgment that frontier communities reserve for those who stepped outside prescribed boundaries. Then Hank Porter, a rancher whose voice carried the authority of a man who'd survived 20 Wyoming winters, through sheer contempt for weakness, gave it a crueler designation. He stood at the counter of Dietrich's trading post with an audience of stockmen and farmers' men whose world had clear rules about what women did and did not do. His voice filled the room with the confidence of someone whose opinions had never been seriously challenged. Poor woman's gone mad with grief. Thinks she's an engineer like her dead husband was. Out there digging like a man, got those little girls hauling rocks. It's unseemly. Someone ought to step in before she hurts herself or them. The murmurs of agreement came quickly, though some carried the uncomfortable edge of men who'd buried their own wives and knew how grief could twist a person into shapes that didn't fit anymore. The name stuck anyway. Within a week, riders passing the Hollister place would shake their heads at the sight of that strange earthwork rising between buildings, and the words "widow's folly" would carry on the wind like a verdict that needed no trial. Margaret Hollister had not come to Wyoming seeking to prove anything to anyone. She'd come seeking distance from a grave in Montana that she couldn't stand to visit, and memories that followed her anyway. She'd been born in 1891 on a Nebraska farm where her father ran a grain mill powered by a water wheel he'd engineered himself. While other girls learned embroidery and pie crusts, Meg had spent afternoons in the mill, watching gears mesh and water flow, asking questions her father answered, because he had no sons, and she was curious enough to listen. She'd met Thomas Hollister in 1911 when he'd come through surveying a railroad spur. He'd been 25, a civil engineer with a degree from a technical college back east, and hands that were soft in ways that made the local men sneer. But those hands could draft plans that turned into bridges and didn't shake when they held surveying equipment. Meg had been 20, unmarried in a town where most girls were wives, by 18, and she'd watched him work with an attention that had nothing to do with his prospects and everything to do with the way he explained why angles mattered. Their courtship had been brief and practical. Thomas had appreciated her questions about load-bearing calculations. Meg had appreciated his willingness to answer them as if she were a colleague rather than a curiosity. They'd married in the spring of 1913, a rushed ceremony that raised eyebrows when Emma arrived in late 1912, 6 months before the wedding. The scandal had been predictable. The marriage had worked anyway, built on the kind of partnership that emerged when two people discovered they could learn from each other. Thomas had taken a position with the Fort Peck Dam project in Montana in 1915, and Meg had followed him to the construction camp with Emma and newborn Rose. The next 3 years had been an education she'd never sought but absorbed nonetheless. She'd lived in a camp where engineers discussed concrete ratios over dinner and where the consequences of miscalculation weren't abstract. She'd learned by proximity and persistence, asking Thomas to explain the blueprints spread across their table at night, watching how Earth structures were built to resist forces that wanted to tear them apart. The winter of 1917 at the dam camp had taught her something more immediate than theory. The workers' barracks had been built quickly, conventionally, with walls that faced the prevailing winds without protection. The men inside had burned wood at rates that seemed impossible, the feeding stoves that glowed red hot and still couldn't push the temperature above freezing. Thomas had explained it to her one night while she'd sat wrapped in every blanket they owned. Emma and Rose huddled beside her. Wind strips heat faster than coal creates it, Meg. You can build the tightest walls in the world, but if you place them where wind can scour them constantly, you're fighting a battle physics won't let you win. Moving air pulls heat away through convection. Still air insulates. The difference isn't small, it's everything. She'd asked him why the camp engineers didn't fix it, and he'd given her a look that mixed frustration with resignation. Because the men who approved the designs weren't the men who had to live in the cold. And because changing methods requires admitting the old methods were wrong, which is harder than you'd think. In the spring of 1918, Thomas Hollister had died when scaffolding collapsed during poor work on the dam's eastern section. 3 men had fallen, 2 had survived with broken bones. Thomas had landed wrong and hadn't survived at all. The company had paid Meg $200 in death benefits and had cleared his belongings from the engineering office within a week. She'd been 27 years old with 2 daughters and a folder full of blueprints she couldn't read without seeing his handwriting in the margins. She'd left Montana in early summer, unable to remain where every structure under construction was something Thomas had helped design but would never see completed. Wyoming had offered homestead land at prices that reflected its brutal reputation, and Meg had bought 40 acres with money she couldn't afford to spend, but couldn't afford not to. Neighbors had helped her build a cabin, working with the efficient pity that frontier communities extended to widows. Samuel Brennan, who owned the sawmill and whose opinion on construction carried weight, earned through 15 years of building half the valley's homes, had supervised the work personally. "We'll build you something solid, Mrs. Hollister. Good tight chinking, proper fireplace, sleeping loft for the girls. This'll keep you safe through whatever comes." The cabin had been exactly what he'd promised, respectable, conventional, built to standards that had served the valley well for 2 decades. Meg had thanked him with the gratitude expected of a woman accepting charity, had moved her daughters into a home that felt nothing like the drafty camp structures they'd left behind, and had prepared for winter with the thoroughness that Thomas's death had taught her to value. Then winter had arrived, and solid hadn't been the same as sufficient. The cold of 1918 to 1919 had come down in November with temperatures that dropped like stones into dark water. By December, the mercury sat below zero more often than above it. The wind arrived from the north in an endless stream that seemed to have no source and no intention of stopping, just an infinite capacity to find every gap and exploit it. Meg had laid in 7 cords of hardwood purchased with money she didn't have, an amount that Samuel Brennan had assured her would be more than enough for a cabin that size with a woman and 2 small children, producing minimal heat demand. She'd burned that wood with the discipline Thomas had taught her about resource management. She kept the fire fed every 3 hours around the clock, had stuffed rags along every seam, where Catherine Miller and the other neighbor women had shown her drafts appeared, had hung extra blankets over the windows as insulation. Emma and Rose had slept in their coats under quilts piled so high the girls disappeared beneath them. Meg had woken every 3 hours to add wood and had found her breath visible in the air above her bed, had watched ice form on the interior walls from condensation freezing faster than the fire could prevent it. The cabin's interior temperature had never exceeded 50 degrees. At night it dropped to 40 or below. The water bucket froze solid. Meals were often cold because maintaining cooking heat meant burning wood at rates that would leave them with nothing by February. Emma and Rose had developed coughs that persisted through January despite honey and steam and every remedy the neighbor women suggested. Catherine Miller had come by weekly with soup had seen the conditions, had said nothing, because what could be said that wouldn't sound like judgment of a woman doing her best. But it was the night of January 15th that had transformed Meg's exhausted endurance into something harder and more focused. Emma had been coughing for 3 days, the sound progressing from dry irritation to something wet and deep. On the 15th, her fever had spiked to the point where her skin burned to touch and her eyes carried the glassy confusion of a child whose body was fighting something it might not win against. Meg had done everything she knew. Cool cloths, despite the cabin's cold honey dissolved in warm water, keeping Emma propped up to help her breathe easier. At 3 in the morning, Meg had been sitting beside Emma's bed, feeding the fire with wood. They couldn't spare the stove roaring, but the room still holding in at 42 degrees. Emma had been coughing in restless half-sleep, each spasm, shaking her small frame in ways that made Meg's chest tighten with fear that felt like drowning. Then Emma had coughed hard enough to wakefully had pulled her hand from her mouth, and in the firelight Meg had seen blood on her daughter's palm. Not much, just a few drops bright against pale skin, but enough. Meg had stared at that blood, and something inside her that had been bending under the weight of widowhood and winter, and the endless effort of keeping her daughters alive, had finally broken and reformed into something that couldn't bend anymore. Her daughter was 6 years old. She was coughing blood because this cabin, built to every standard that men like Samuel Brennan considered proper, couldn't hold enough heat to keep a child's lungs from being damaged by air or so cold it hurt to inhale. She'd held Emma until the coughing subsided and sleep returned fitful and shallow. Then she'd sat in the darkness, listening to the wind hammer the north wall with force that made the logs shudder. And she'd remembered Thomas explaining convective heat loss while they'd sat in that freezing barracks at the dam camp. He'd drawn diagrams on paper, had shown her how wind didn't just make cold air feel colder, but actively stripped heat from surfaces faster than still air could. A wall exposed to wind at 0 degrees lost heat 20 times faster than a wall exposed to still air at the same temperature. The north wall of this cabin faced open prairie. There was nothing between it and the wind except 40 feet of empty space to the barn. That wind hit the logs with enough force to pull heat through the wood itself, no matter how carefully chinked, no matter how well built. The cabin was losing this fight not because it was poorly constructed, but because it was positioned to fight a battle it couldn't win. Thomas's voice came back to her across the distance of death with perfect clarity. Words he'd spoken watching those barracks burn through wood while men froze inside them. You can't fight wind with more fire. You have to stop the wind from reaching what you're trying to protect. Create dead airspace. Use earth for thermal mass. Work with physics instead of against it. Catherine Miller had found her at dawn, still sitting beside Emma's bed. The fire burned low. The cabin temperature dropped to 38 degrees. Catherine had set down the basket she had brought and had sat without speaking, a widow herself, who understood that some nights changed you in ways that couldn't be explained. Meg's voice had come out flat, emptied of everything except resolve. Never again, Catherine. Catherine had understood without needing clarification. Emma had recovered slowly over the following 2 weeks, the blood not returning, but the cough persisting until March. By the time spring arrived and released its grip, Meg had spent 100 hours sitting by the fire while her daughter slept, not just keeping them warm, but watching. Watching how the wind moved snow against the cabin's north wall, while leaving the south side comparatively clear. Watching which walls shed interior frost first when morning sun hit them. Watching where drafts came from, despite rag stuffing that she and Catherine renewed weekly. She'd begun seeing the cabin not as shelter, but as a body exposed to assault it had no defense against. The barn stood 40 feet north of the cabin, directly in the path of the prevailing wind. If she could connect them, put the barn between the wind and the cabin, create an enclosed space where air couldn't move, she could build what Thomas had described in theory. A buffer zone, a coat for the house. Through spring and summer, the idea had taken shape as Meg worked a small garden that kept them fed and tended the chickens that provided eggs to trade for necessities. She'd pulled out Thomas's old engineering notebooks, the ones she'd packed from Montana because throwing them away had felt like losing him twice. His handwriting filled pages with calculations and sketches, principles of drainage and earth structures and thermodynamics that he'd learned in college and refined through practice. One evening in June, she tried to explain it to Catherine Miller using Emma's wooden alphabet blocks to build a model on the kitchen table. She'd arranged blocks for cabin quarter barn, had used her hands to show wind flow. Still air holds heat. Moving air steals it. If I can trap a pocket of still air along the entire north wall, the wind can't strip heat anymore. The cabin won't have to fight so hard to stay warm. Catherine had studied the block model with the careful attention of a woman who'd learned not to dismiss ideas simply because they came from unexpected sources. You're talking about a tunnel, 40 feet long. That's a lot of digging for a woman alone. Meg had met her eyes with the kind of certainty that comes from having already decided the cost doesn't matter. It's less digging than a grave, I'll manage. The opportunity to build had come in late July when a writer brought news of an Army surplus sale at Camp Douglas in Utah. The military was liquidating materials left over from the war, and lumber and corrugated metal were going for a fraction of normal prices. Meg had hitched their aging wagon, had taken Emma and Rose on a 3-day journey south, and had spent $45 she couldn't easily spare on rough-cut lumber and metal sheeting that would have cost 3 times that at any mill. She'd hired a freight wagon to haul it back another $15 that brought her savings perilously close to nothing. When she'd arrived home with a wagon full of materials, Catherine had come out from the neighboring property where she lived with her brother, Daniel Cross, her expression mixing hope with worry. "You're really going to build this?" It wasn't a question. Meg had climbed down from the wagon seat stiff from 3 days of travel and had stood looking at the 40 feet between cabin and barn. "I'm really going to build it." The digging had started the next morning. August brought heat that made physical labor punishing, but Meg had welcomed it after the winter that still woke her some nights with the sound of Emma coughing. She'd marked the trench with string pulled tight between stakes 40 feet long and 10 feet wide running straight from cabin to barn. Then she'd started moving earth. 4 feet down was the target depth, well below the frost line that could heave foundations and crack stone. Thomas had drilled that principle into here during conversations about dam construction. Go below frost, or accept failure when the ground freezes and thaws. The Wyoming soil was hard-packed and full of rocks that required a pry bar to loosen and both hands to haul away. Meg would start at dawn before the heat belt would work until mid-morning, when the sun made continuation dangerous would resume in late afternoon and continue until darkness made precision impossible. Emma and Rose helped in the way 7-year-olds and 5-year-olds could, carrying smaller stones to a pile and bringing water when their mother's face flushed too red with exertion. They'd watch her work with the solemn attention of children who understood something important was happening, even if they couldn't fully grasp why. Emma's question had been inevitable, asked one afternoon while Meg straightened from the trench to ease the ache in her back. "Why are you digging such a big hole?" Mama Meg had wiped sweat from her face with a sleeve and had considered how to explain thermodynamics to a child who still thought wind was just air that moved fast. "You remember how cold it was last winter? How the wind made it even colder?" Both girls had nodded, their faces showing they remembered very well. "I'm building something that'll stop the wind from touching our house, like putting a big coat around it. Then we'll stay warmer inside and you won't get sick like you did." Rose, literal-minded in the way of 5-year-olds, had frowned at the logic. "Coats go on people, not houses." Meg had managed a smile despite exhaustion. "This one's going on our house anyway." The trench had consumed 3 weeks of labor that left Meg's hands blistered and her back aching in ways that made sleeping difficult. When it was finally complete, she'd stood at one end looking down 40 feet of channel cut through earth that had resisted every foot, and she'd felt not triumph, but grim satisfaction at having finished the hardest part. Then she'd begun the next phase. 6 inches of coarse gravel went into the trench bottom, a drainage bed to prevent water from pooling and undermining everything built above it. Thomas had stressed this in his notebooks, had sketched examples of structures that failed from moisture that couldn't escape. The gravel had to be hauled from a creek bed 2 miles distant, loaded into the wagon by hand, and spread evenly along the trench length. Another week vanished into work that showed no visible progress to anyone riding past. On the gravel foundation, Meg built low stone walls running the trenches full length on both sides, 2 feet high, and mortared with clay and sand mixed to consistency, Thomas's notes specified. The stones came from her own land fieldstone she'd been clearing anyway, fitted together with attention to stability rather than appearance. The walls didn't need to support the roof's weight directly. They were there to provide stable footing and direct any infiltrating water toward drainage points she'd planned at each end. The framing came next, and this was where Thomas's teaching became most crucial. The lumber from Camp Douglas was rough and uneven, but it was dry and solid enough for the purpose. Meg had watched Thomas frame structures at the dam. Camp had asked enough questions about load distribution and bracing that she understood the principles even if her execution lacked polish. The corridor walls rose to 7 feet at their lowest point, giving enough headroom to walk through comfortably. The roof she framed with gentle slope 8 feet at the cabin end, tapering to 7 at the barn end, just enough pitch to shed snow and rain without creating excessive wind resistance. The corrugated metal sheeting went on piece by piece, each one overlapped and secured with nails driven through pre-drilled holes to prevent the brittle metal from splitting. For laying the metal, she'd put down tar paper overlapping seams by 6 inches, the way Thomas's notes specified for waterproofing. Where the new roof met cabin and barn, she'd fabricated flashing from scrap tin, hammering it flat, and bending it carefully to create seals that would shed water rather than channel it into gaps. The work required patience she had to actively summon because a half-inch gap could mean water damage that would validate every prediction of failure. The earth berming came last, and Meg understood this element would prove either vindication or condemnation of the entire design. She'd excavated enough dirt from the trench to fill several wagon loads. Now she piled it back against the corridor's east and west walls, banking it up to the eaves and slopes that would shed water away from the structure. She packed it down with the shovel's flat blade tamping until the earth felt solid enough to resist erosion, then seeded it with prairie grass to bind everything together into permanent coverage. The principle came directly from Thomas's dam work, though he'd called it revetment rather than berming. Earth was thermal mass that absorbed and released heat, slowly buffering against the violent temperature swings that characterize high plains weather. By burying the corridor walls under several feet of soil, Meg was making them nearly immune to sudden cold that would freeze exposed wood. The ground would freeze eventually but slowly, and it would never reach the extreme cold of winter air. The buried walls would stay cool rather than frozen, protected rather than exposed. One evening in late September, with the structure nearly complete, Meg had tried to explain the concept to Catherine using the teaching tools available. Emma had been building towers with her alphabet blocks, and Meg had borrowed them to construct a model showing cabin corridor and barn in relation to prevailing wind direction. Still air insulates. Moving air steals heat. That's the whole principle. This corridor traps a 40-foot pocket of still air against our cabin's north side, like the dead airspace in a double-pane window, but large enough to matter. The earth around it acts like a blanket, keeping the corridor itself from getting as cold as outside air. Everything works together. Catherine had examined the model with concentration that suggested she was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply being polite. And the dirt covering the walls keeps them from freezing, the same way our cabin walls freeze now. Earth temperature changes slowly. Once this settles, the corridor walls won't feel winter cold the same way. They'll stay protected. Emma had reclaimed her blocks with the territorial certainty of a child whose possessions had been borrowed. But Catherine had already seen enough to nod slowly. "I hope you're right, Meg." The words carried weight beyond their surface simplicity. Catherine had become more than a neighbor over the past year. She was the closest thing Meg had to a friend in this valley, a widow herself, who understood the particular isolation of being a woman alone in a place that organized itself around married couples and family units. So do I. Meg had cut two small vents high on the corridor's east and west walls, each fitted with wooden shutters that could be operated from inside. Summer months would require air circulation to prevent the enclosed space from becoming humid and encouraging rot. Winter would require those vents sealed tight to maintain the dead air buffer. It was a detail that reflected understanding that structures needed to adapt to changing conditions rather than remain static. The total cost tallied in the account ledger Catherine had taught her to keep came to $120. $45 for the surplus materials, $35 for additional lumber from Samuel Brennan's mill, $20 for tar paper and tin scrap sheet hammered into flashing, $20 for nails hinge hardware for the shutters and miscellaneous supplies. It was more than she could comfortably afford, representing nearly all the reserves she'd maintained for emergencies. But Emma Coughing Blood had redefined what constituted emergency. The finished structure looked exactly as strange as Meg had known it would. From the county road, the Hollister homestead no longer appeared as a cabin with separate barn. It looked like something inexplicable had occurred, like the land itself had risen to connect two buildings in a way that suggested either desperation or delusion. The barn seemed to have grown a tail that reached toward the cabin. The cabin appeared afflicted by an earthen growth. Only the dark openings at either end and the metal roof's dull gleam were visible above earth, already showing the first green shoots of seeded grass. Catherine had stood beside Meg on the last day of September, looking at the completed work. She'd pulled her shawl tighter despite mild air, and her voice had carried awareness of what was coming. "People are going to think you've lost your mind, Meg." Meg hadn't looked away from the northern horizon, where the sky showed the particular pale blue that preceded winter. Let them think what they need to think. But Catherine's real concern had gone deeper, voiced only when she confirmed the girls were out of earshot playing near the barn. They were going to say grief made you incapable. They're going to question whether you should be raising those girls alone. Daniel's already mentioned it, says people at church are talking about whether someone should step in. Meg had finally turned to meet Catherine's eyes, and what Catherine saw there was neither fear nor defiance, but the bedrock certainty of a woman who'd watched her daughter bleed from lungs damaged by cold. "I'd rather have people question my sanity than bury my children because I was too concerned with the propriety to do what needed doing." Let them talk. Emma and Rose staying warm matters more than Daniel's opinion or anyone else's. The neighbors had indeed thought and said exactly what Catherine predicted, but their judgment arrived with the specificity that cut deeper than general disapproval. Samuel Brennan had been the first to visit, arriving on an October morning when frost painted the grass silver. He'd walked around the structure with the deliberate attention of a professional whose expertise was being challenged by someone unqualified. He'd kicked at the earth berm with his boot heel. He'd squinted at roof lines and studied junctions where new construction met existing buildings. Finally, he'd stopped in front of Meg with an expression mixing professional concern with genuine worry for a woman he tried to help. "Mrs. Hollister, I don't know where you got these ideas, but this structure won't work the way you're hoping." He'd pointed at the corner where corridor roof met cabin wall. "You've created a moisture trap right there. Snow's going to accumulate in that corner, something fierce. When it melts, water will seep into your logs, and within 2 years, that whole north wall will be rotten. You'll have structural failure and probably mold growth that'll make your daughter sicker than any cold." Then he'd kick the berm again harder. "And this earth piled against wood, you're just inviting rot and insect infestation. Wood needs air circulation to stay sound. You've buried your house alive. This thing will be falling apart by spring, and I say that as someone who's been building in this valley for 15 years. Meg had listened with the patience Thomas had taught her about dealing with men whose expertise was real but incomplete. She'd built in drainage specifically to prevent what Brennan described. She'd used tar paper and flashing exactly because Thomas's notes stressed moisture management. But she'd also learned that arguing with established authority rarely changed minds before results could speak. "My husband was a civil engineer, Mr. Brennan. He taught me about drainage and moisture control. I've accounted for water flow. That's fine for someone with proper training, but book learning isn't the same as understanding how Wyoming weather works. No offense intended, Mrs. Hollister, but a woman reading her dead husband's notes isn't qualified to design structures that have to survive what's coming. Brennan had stopped himself, seeming to realize his words had gone further than he'd intended, but the damage was complete. He'd shaken his head in the universal gesture of abandoning an argument deemed futile. We'll see come spring, I suppose. He'd left with concern still written across his face, and by nightfall, his assessment had spread through the valley with the speed that news travels in isolated communities, hungry for anything that breaks routine. Samuel Brennan himself had declared the widow's project unsound. The professional had spoken, and that carried weight that Meg's theoretical knowledge couldn't yet counter. The public humiliation had arrived a week later at the trading post. Meg had needed salt and coffee staples she couldn't produce and couldn't do without. She'd ridden into town on a Tuesday afternoon when the store was busy with farmers and ranchers restocking before weather turned. She'd walked in to find Hank Porter holding forth near the counter, his voice carrying the particular authority of men who've never doubted their right to judge others. Well, now look who's come to town. Mrs. Hollister herself. You finished that digging project of yours yet? The store had gone quiet with the anticipatory silence that meant everyone present recognized entertainment was about to occur. Meg had kept walking toward the counter, her face neutral, her eyes forward. Porter had moved to partially block her path, not quite aggressive but clearly intentional. Heard you built yourself some kind of tunnel between your buildings. That true you planning to live like a prairie dog? Or maybe you figure if you hide underground, the winter won't find you. A few men had chuckled the nervous laughter of people unsure whether this was humor or cruelty, but unwilling to challenge it either way. Meg had stopped, had looked at Porter with the kind of level patience that comes from having survived actual hardship, and recognizing that this wasn't it. Excuse me, Mr. Porter, I need to purchase my supplies. Porter had held position for another moment, savoring the attention of men who found his confidence reassuring in its simplicity. Then he'd stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. Of course, of course. Don't mean to keep you, though I'd have thought a woman in your position would want advice from men who know this country. Pride's a dangerous thing when you've got children depending on you. The laughter had been more confident this time, validation that Porter's point had landed. Meg had made her purchases in silence, had paid with coins she'd counted twice to ensure accuracy, and had left. The laughter had followed her into the street, and with it had come the name that would prove more durable than any other. The widow's folly said with emphasis that made clear the folly was as much in her presumption as in her construction. Catherine had felt the social consequences more immediately than Meg. At the church social the following week, women who had been cordial if distant had suddenly discovered urgent reasons to be elsewhere when Catherine approached. Conversations would pause when she entered rooms replaced by smiles that didn't reach eyes and glances that carried pity performing as sympathy. At the quilting circle, talk had turned to the challenges of frontier life and how some people simply lack the temperament for it, particularly women left alone, who might not have the judgment required to make sound decisions without male guidance. One woman, whose name Catherine made a point of not remembering, had addressed her with concern so false it rang like bad piano. Catherine, dear, how is poor Margaret managing? It must be so difficult for her, trying to do work she's not suited for. Does she seem well to you, mentally, I mean? With those girls to think about and all? Catherine had recognized the trap in the question and had answered with dignity that refused to participate in gossip disguised as concern. Meg is managing remarkably well, thank you for asking. She'd finished her quilting, square in silence while conversation moved to safer subjects, but the message had been delivered. The Hollister family was now the object of community speculation, and that speculation questioned not just Meg's competence, but her fitness to raise her daughters. In a society that measured women's worth by their adherence to prescribed roles, attempting to be an engineer was as damning as any other deviation. The deepest cut had come from Catherine's own brother. Daniel Cross had ridden out on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October, ostensibly for a family visit. He was 3 years Catherine's senior, a rancher who'd built his own place through adherence to proven methods and careful avoidance of anything that looked like risk. He valued tradition because tradition represented accumulated wisdom of men who'd survived, and deviation from it suggested either arrogance or foolishness. He'd stood with Meg, looking at the corridor, his expression troubled, in ways that suggested genuine concern rather than Porter's casual cruelty. When he'd finally spoken, his words had carried the weight of family obligation. Meg, I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it as someone who wants what's best for you and my sister and those girls. Meg had waited, knowing what was coming, but willing to let him speak. People are talking, not just at church, but throughout the valley. They're saying things about your judgment, about whether you're in a proper state of mind to be making decisions this significant. They're questioning whether a woman alone, especially one who's suffered the loss you have, should be attempting work that's beyond her capabilities. I'm worried about what this means for Emma and Rose. A mother's reputation affects her children, and right now you're making yourself a spectacle that's going to follow those girls as they grow. Meg had absorbed this quietly, her face showing nothing while her mind worked through the implications. When she'd responded, her voice had been steady, carrying none of the defensiveness Daniel had perhaps expected. I appreciate your concern, Daniel, but I'm not trying to make a spectacle. I'm trying to keep my daughters from getting sick again, like Emma did last winter. That's all. If people want to judge me for that, they're welcome to their opinions. Daniel had shaken his head with visible frustration at her refusal to recognize the social danger she was courting. It's not just opinions, Meg. It's about your standing in this community. You need these people. When you need help with repairs or if something happens and you need assistance, these are the people who will either come or stay home based on what they think of you. And right now, they think you're either unable to accept your limitations or too grief-stricken to see clearly. Either way, it makes you someone they're not sure they should trust with children's welfare. The conversation had ended badly, with Daniel riding away unsatisfied and Meg standing beside her strange structure, unmoved in her conviction, but newly aware of the price her daughters might pay for her determination. That night, Catherine had found her sitting outside in the dark, looking at stars that offered no answers. Catherine had sat beside her without speaking for a long time. When she'd finally broken the silence, her voice had carried a hardness Meg rarely heard from her. Daniel's wrong. Meg had turned surprised. Catherine's face had been set in lines of determination that transformed her soft features into something formidable. He's wrong because he thinks reputation matters more than survival. He's wrong because he's measuring you by what men think women should be instead of what you actually are. And he's wrong because he doesn't understand what I saw last January when Emma was coughing blood and you were burning wood you couldn't afford while the cabin stayed cold enough to see your breath. She'd stood brushing dirt from her skirt with sharp movements. Let them talk, Meg. Come December, we'll see who's warm and who's still burning through wood they can't spare while their children freeze. By late October, as the first serious cold began testing the valley's preparations, not one person beyond Meg and Catherine believed the corridor would function as intended. The consensus was complete and confident. Margaret Hollister had wasted time, money, and effort on a structure that would either rot from moisture accumulation, collapse under snow load, or simply fail to provide any meaningful thermal benefit. It was a monument to grief-driven delusion, a 40-foot confession that its builder lacked both the expertise to succeed and the wisdom to recognize her own limitations. The air had begun carrying the metallic edge that preceded serious winter. Grass had turned brown. Cottonwoods along the creek had dropped leaves in a single week, as if nature itself was preparing for siege. Cattle were being moved to winter range. Wood was being stacked in quantities that reflected experience-earned anxiety. Families were checking supplies and calculating whether they'd laid in enough to last until spring offered relief. Meg had stacked 2 cords of pine and cottonwood, whatever she could cut from her own land or trade chickens to obtain. It was less than half what she'd burned the previous winter, a gamble that the corridor would reduce heating needs so dramatically that fuel could be proportionally reduced. Her neighbors, seeing the modest pile, had added it to their list of evidence that the widow didn't understand the country she'd chosen to inhabit. November arrived with temperatures that made everyone check their preparations twice. The first snow came on the 8th, light enough to melt by afternoon. The second came on the 12th, heavier, and it stayed. The temperature had begun its long descent toward the killing cold that would define the winter of 1919 to 1920. Inside the Hollister cabin, Meg and Catherine had prepared as thoroughly as knowledge and limited means allowed. They'd laid in flour and beans and salt pork. They'd moved the girls' bed back down from the loft to where heat would reach them better. They'd checked every chink between logs and renewed rag stuffing where needed. But this year, for the first time, they had something different. They had the corridor, and they had Meg's conviction that Thomas's principles would work even if his hands couldn't build them. On the last mild afternoon before the serious cold arrived, Catherine had stood in the corridor's doorway looking down its length toward the barn. The space was dim lit only by light entering from either end. The earthen walls gave it the feel of a root cellar, cool and still. The silence inside was profound after months of constant wind. It feels protected in here, safe like a cave. Meg had joined her hand finding Catherine's in a gesture of friendship that had become sisterhood through shared struggle. That's exactly the idea. Wind can't reach inside, heat can't escape, everything else is just details. Catherine had squeezed her hand. I hope this works, Meg. For the girl's sake. Meg had squeezed back. It will work. It has to. They'd stood together in the stillness, neither speaking the fear that if this failed, if the corridor proved as foolish as everyone believed, Meg would have wasted resources she couldn't afford to waste and marked herself as incompetent in ways that might give Daniel's concerns about the girl's actual legal weight. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The judgment couldn't have been clearer, and the winter approaching would settle every question with finality that no amount of explanation could soften. The wind had already begun rising outside the first sustained blow of the season that would test whether Margaret Hollister was a widow who'd learned engineering from a dead husband or just a grieving woman who'd built an expensive monument to denial. Either way, the answer was arriving on one that cared nothing for human hope or fear, only for the physics that governed heat and cold and the survival of those caught between them. November descended on Wyoming like judgment rendered without mercy, and what it judged was every assumption the valley held about adequate preparation. The temperature on the 28th dropped to 5 degrees below zero overnight, a reading that would have been notable in December, but carried ominous weight in November. It meant the season had started with force rather than building. Gradually, an experience suggested such beginnings led to brutal middles and worse endings. The thermometer at the trading post became a daily gathering point for men who wanted confirmation of what their bodies already told them. December 8th brought 18 below. Men stamped their feet and spoke in abbreviated sentences, conserving energy the way they conserved everything else when winter showed teeth. Wood supplies that had seemed prudent in October now looked insufficient. Stock that had appeared healthy now looked vulnerable in ways that made ranchers calculate losses they hoped to avoid, but expected anyway. December 12th arrived with wind that carried more than cold. It carried the scent of something metallic and final. The smell of air so dry and frozen it seemed to have lost properties that made it breathable. The mercury plunged to 31 below zero. Ice formed on the interior surfaces of windows in houses built with double-pane glass, meant to prevent exactly that. Water left in buckets overnight transformed into solid blocks requiring axes to break apart or prolonged stove heat to melt into something drinkable. Then December 18th came bringing cold that crossed from hardship into genuine danger. The trading post thermometer registered 38 degrees below zero at dawn, and the mercury had frozen solid at the tube's bottom, unable to contract further. Riders coming into town reported that their horses' breath was freezing, mid-exhale coating muzzles in ice that had to be chipped away before the animals could drink. The north wind ran at 30 to 40 miles per hour, sustained with gusts hitting harder. Men who understood such calculations estimated wind chill at 60 degrees below zero, a number that meant exposed human flesh would freeze solid within minutes. For 23 consecutive days beginning December 18th, the temperature never climbed above zero. Not at dawn when hope might suggest warming, not at noon when the sun reached its low arc across the southern sky, not at sunset when the day's end might bring relief. The sun would rise into air so clear and pale it looked fragile, would track its inadequate path, and would set having accomplished nothing except to make shadows sharp enough to draw blood. Snow that fell during this period didn't drift in patterns recognizable from previous winters. It was compacted by relentless wind into formations hard as concrete, sculpted into shapes that looked deliberate in their malice. This wasn't weather, it was siege. The Kobe Ranch, among the valley's largest and most established operations, had prepared with the thoroughness that comes from 2 decades of survived winters. They'd laid in 8 cords of seasoned hardwood oak and maple hauled up from lower elevations at expense that made the ranch owner wince but pay anyway. Their main house featured double-wall insulation and a stone fireplace dimensioned to burn 3-foot logs. By every standard that Frontier Wyoming recognized, they'd done everything correctly. By December 20th, they were consuming 2 cords of expensive hardwood monthly just to maintain the main house at 42 degrees. The foreman's family, housed in a smaller cabin on the property, huddled around a stove, glowing cherry red, that still couldn't push interior temperature above freezing. His children had developed deep barking coughs that wouldn't clear the sound of lungs irritated by breathing air so cold it damaged tissue with each inhalation. Daniel Cross, Catherine's brother, had entered winter confident in preparations guided by Samuel Brennan's specifications. He had laid in 5 cords of mixed wood. His cabin featured tight chinking and a good stove. By Christmas, he was burning nearly 2 cords monthly, and his house held at 48 degrees on favorable days, 40 on bad ones. His wife had abandoned attempts to keep the kitchen warm enough for baking. She was melting snow on the stove for drinking water because their well pump had frozen solid despite housing meant to prevent it. Samuel Brennan himself, the valley's construction authority, had built his home to standards perfected across 15 years. Minimal gaps-tight chinking, a fireplace engineered for maximum heat radiation. He'd laid in 7 cords of prime seasoned oak, the finest wood available. He was burning 2 cords monthly, and his house held at 45 degrees. His wife slept in wool stockings and heavy nightgown under 3 quilts. His children wore coats indoors as routine rather than exception. Failure modes across the valley multiplied like fractures, spreading through ice under impossible pressure. Families who'd economized by cutting green wood or lacked time to season it properly found their fires sputtering and smoking, filling cabins with acrid haze that burned eyes and throats while providing almost no heat. Moisture in unseasoned wood had to be boiled off before combustion could begin, a catastrophic energy waste that transformed precious fuel into expensive steam. Several cabins experienced chimney fires as desperate families pushed stoves beyond safe limits, attempting to extract more heat from wood that couldn't provide it. Creosote accumulated from incomplete combustion would ignite in roaring conflagrations that brought men running with ladders and buckets, everyone understanding that a chimney fire spreading to the roof meant burning a family out into conditions that made homelessness a death sentence. Livestock began dying in numbers that transformed loss from unfortunate to catastrophic. Cows were discovered frozen in lean-tos, standing or lying where they'd sought shelter that proved inadequate. Ice had formed so rapidly in their lungs they died before falling. Chickens froze on roosts, small bodies that had survived previous winters but couldn't survive this one. Horses, hardier than most animals, nonetheless showed distress signs that experienced ranchers recognized as precursors to cold-induced colic or worse. People started burning items never intended as fuel. Furniture that had traveled in wagons from distant states went into stoves. Fence posts were pulled up and split. Scrap lumber from sheds was sacrificed. Anything combustible became fuel, and the line between necessary and valuable blurred into irrelevance. Dignity had been the first casualty of cold. Hope was following closely behind. Hank Porter, the man who'd coined the term widow's folly and made Margaret Hollister the target of his most confident mockery, owned a spread that should have weathered any winter. He ran 40 head of cattle, maintained 2 barns, employed a hand for heavy work. He'd entered winter confident that his experience and resources would see him through whatever the season delivered. On the night of December 27th, 14 of his cattle died, not scattered across his range where they might have been victims of individual misfortune, but clustered in one barn where they'd sought shelter. Temperature had dropped so rapidly and wind had found so many gaps in construction meant to be protective that the animals had essentially frozen while standing together, their combined body heat inadequate against physics of air, moving at 40 miles per hour through spaces supposed to be secure. Porter had found them at dawn, stiff and frosted, their eyes open, and breath crystallized on muzzles. The financial loss was staggering enough to threaten his entire operation, but the blow to his confidence cut deeper. He'd believed he understood this land. He'd believed his toughness and experience constituted sufficient armor. Standing in his barn looking at 14 dead cattle, he'd understood for the first time that nature didn't negotiate with toughness. It simply took what it wanted. He'd ridden into town 2 days later for emergency feed, and men at the trading post had seen something in his face that silenced usual banter. Hank Porter looked like someone who'd been introduced to his own mortality and hadn't enjoyed the meeting. Through all this suffering that was transforming the valley into a laboratory of human endurance, people began noticing something peculiar about the Hollister place. The observations started small, disconnected, easy to dismiss individually, but increasingly difficult to ignore in accumulation. The smoke rising from the Hollister chimney was wrong. Every other chimney in the valley poured thick columns of black or gray smoke, signatures of fires burning hot, in fast, consuming wood at rates that would have seemed wasteful in normal years, but were necessary now. The Hollister chimney produced a thin, lazy wisp of pale smoke, suggesting a fire barely awake, certainly not working hard enough to heat a house in this cold. A rider passing the Hollister homestead during a brief lull in wind on January 2nd's morning had seen something that made him rein his horse to a halt and stare. Margaret Hollister had emerged from her barn and walked toward her cabin. She'd been wearing a shawl over her house dress, no heavy coat, no scarf wrapped around her face. Her breath had been visible in the air, but she'd walked at normal pace, unhurried, carrying a milk pail, as if crossing her yard in April, rather than in cold that had killed livestock and sent everyone else scrambling between buildings and layers of wool and fur. The rider had sat watching until Meg disappeared into the cabin. Then he'd ridden to town with a story he told at the trading post, with the confusion that comes from witnessing something violating expected reality. The men who heard it decided that Margaret Hollister had finally broken that cold, had shattered something in her mind, and she'd stopped caring about basic survival. It was the only explanation making sense. But the image lingered, a woman in just a shawl and 30 below cold, walking without hurry, disappearing into a cabin that should have been as frigid as everyone else's. The widow's folly was still visible as a long, snow-covered mound, but something was occurring inside that cabin that didn't match what was happening everywhere else. The breaking point arrived on December 23rd, and it came from an unexpected direction. Samuel Brennan had spent the previous week making emergency deliveries to families he knew were in desperate straits. He had a sleigh modified for wood hauling, and he'd been selling quarter-cord loads to people who'd burned through supplies faster than anticipated. He was losing money on every delivery, cutting and hauling costs exceeding what he could charge, families already stretched past breaking. But Samuel Brennan believed in community obligation, and he couldn't let neighbors freeze while he had wood to sell. On his delivery list for the 23rd was the Hollister family. He'd loaded his sleigh with a quarter cord of his best oak premium wood he normally reserved for personal use or best customers. He was bringing it as a gift, not for sale. He was certain that the young widow with her foolish construction project must be in dire condition. Meg had only laid in 2 cords of pine for winter, barely a quarter of what Brennan knew was necessary. The quarter that absurd tunnel had probably failed in exactly the ways he'd predicted, creating moisture problems that made the cabin even harder to heat than before. Brennan had loaded that oak with grim satisfaction in being proven right, mixed with genuine concern for Catherine's friend and her daughters. He'd known Meg was stubborn, but he'd expected she would come asking for help before things became truly dangerous. The fact that she hadn't was troubling. Pride could kill a family as surely as cold. The temperature that morning was 35 below zero. Wind was blowing hard enough that Brennan had to wrap his face completely, leaving only his eyes exposed, and even those watered from cold. The reins in his hands felt like iron bars, and his horse was reluctant to move its breath, coming in great clouds that froze instantly into ice crystals, catching pale morning light. He pulled up to the Hollister cabin, expecting to see signs of a family barely holding on. Desperate smoke from the chimney, ice thick on windows, maybe one of the girls watching from inside, faces pinched with cold and worry. He'd rehearsed what he'd say. He'd be kind but firm. There was no shame in accepting help. Pride was a luxury no one could afford in weather like this. He climbed down from the sleigh, his joints stiff from cold despite clothing layers. He approached the door, raised his fist, and knocked hard enough to be heard over the wind. Inside his wrappings, he braced himself for what he expected to find. The door opened. Margaret Hollister stood in the doorway, and the first thing hitting Samuel wasn't visual. It was the warmth. It rolled out of that open door like a physical presence, a wave of air so warm it felt like stepping from a frozen lake surface into a heated room. The temperature differential was so extreme that for a moment Samuel's mind couldn't process what he was experiencing. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Behind Meg, visible through the door frame, the cabin's interior glowed with lamplight. Emma and Rose were sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread before them, drawing with the concentration children apply to tasks they've chosen themselves. They were wearing simple cotton dresses, not coats, not blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Dresses, light fabric suitable for a spring afternoon, not for a cabin in the middle of the worst cold snap in living memory. Meg looked at Samuel's ice-encrusted wrappings and at the wood piled in his sleigh, and her expression shifted through surprise to understanding to something that might have been gentle amusement. "Mr. Brennan, is everything all right?" He couldn't speak. His voice had frozen along with his ability to process what he was seeing. He just stood there, staring past her into the impossible warmth of that cabin. Meg's expression softened into concern, but not the kind of concern he had expected to see directed at him. "That's very kind of you to bring wood, but we're managing fine. Please come in out of that wind before you freeze." He stepped through the door and into an environment so divorced from what he'd expected that it felt like crossing into another season entirely. The warmth was everywhere, even and steady. There was no smoke because the fire wasn't being pushed hard. There was no draft because the walls weren't bleeding heat. The girls looked up from their drawings, said hello with the casual friendliness of children whose world was safe and comfortable, then returned to their work. Meg came through the interior door leading to the corridor, having just returned from the barn with a pail of fresh milk. She was in her house dress, her hair pinned up, her face calm, showing none of the drawn exhaustion that Samuel had seen on every other face in the valley for the past month. She nodded at Samuel with the quiet courtesy of a woman receiving an unexpected guest. "Mr. Brennan, good to see you. I appreciate you coming out in this weather." Samuel finally found his voice, though it came out rough from cold and shock. "How are you doing this?" The question encompassed everything. The warmth, the children in summer dresses, the small foyer, the absence of desperation. Meg gestured toward the stove, where a modest fire was burning with the lazy confidence of flame that didn't need to work hard. "Just pine and cottonwood. Whatever I can cut from the property or trade for. We're burning less than half a cord every 2 weeks." The statement landed in Samuel's mind like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of implication spreading outward into everything he thought he knew about heating a home in Wyoming. Less than half a cord every 2 weeks meant less than a cord per month. People were burning 2 cords monthly, sometimes more, and they were freezing. The Hollisters were burning a quarter of that and were comfortable enough for children to wear cotton dresses indoors. Samuel's eyes swept the room looking for the trick, the hidden stove, the secret heat source that would explain this impossible comfort. His gaze landed on the wall thermometer hanging beside the window, an old mercury model that couldn't be manipulated or misread. He walked over to it, his boots loud on the wooden floor, and leaned in close. The mercury sat at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, clear, undeniable, precise. 68 degrees while outside the air was 35 below zero, a differential of 103 degrees. Samuel had families on his delivery list who would celebrate if they could get their homes to 40. He had customers burning premium oak by the cord who couldn't push past 45. And Margaret Hollister, with her foolish corridor and her cheap pine, was maintaining 68. Samuel reached out and touched the north wall. The wall he'd sworn would be rotting by now, would be caked in ice and weeping moisture from snow melting in the corner where the corridor's roof met the cabin. His hands, still numb from the cold outside, felt the wood. It was cool to the touch, but completely dry. No frost, no moisture, no hint of the rot he'd predicted with the confidence of 15 years' experience. His voice came out flat, stripped of everything except the disbelief of a man whose professional certainty was collapsing. My house is 45 degrees. I'm burning 2 cords of seasoned oak a month. Meg just nodded, neither gloating nor explaining, just acknowledging the statement as fact. Then she gestured toward the door leading to the corridor. Let me show you something. She opened the door and Samuel stepped into the space he'd mentally condemned as a moisture trap and a fool's project. The air was chilly but absolutely still. Outside wind was howling at 40 miles per hour. In here, the loudest sound was their breathing. It was like stepping into a cave, a pocket carved out of winter's relentless assault, where basic rules seemed suspended. Meg's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, carrying none of the vindication she might have been entitled to. The wind never touches the cabin, Mr. Brennan. That's the entire secret. My husband taught me this principle working on dam construction in Montana. Moving air steals heat through convection. Still air insulates. The corridor blocks the wind completely. The earth around it holds stable temperature. The air in here creates a buffer zone. We're not trying to heat the valley, just the cabin. Simple as that. Samuel stood in that still, dim space, and understanding came not as sudden revelation, but as slow, terrible weight. Everything he knew about building in this climate had been incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but missing something fundamental. You could build a tight house with good chinking and strong walls, but if you built it where wind could scour it constantly, you were fighting a battle physics wouldn't let you win. The wind was the enemy, not the cold. And Margaret Hollister had understood that while everyone else, including Samuel himself, had kept building houses that stood naked to the gale. Back inside the cabin, Samuel pulled his notebook from his coat pocket with hands that were starting to thaw and therefore starting to hurt. He began writing down numbers comparing what he knew about fuel consumption across the valley with what he was seeing here. Colby Ranch, 2 cords of hardwood per month, 42 degrees inside. Daniel Cross, nearly 2 cords of mixed wood per month, 48 degrees. His own house, 2 cords of prime oak, 45 degrees. The Hollister cabin, half a cord of pine per month, 68 degrees. The efficiency wasn't incremental. It wasn't a matter of being 10 or 15% better. It was a different category of performance entirely. It wasn't a better way of doing the same thing. It was a fundamentally different approach that made everything Samuel had been doing look like expensive, exhausting failure. He stood in that warm cabin for a long time watching the girls draw, watching Meg move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who wasn't wearing 3 layers of wool, watching the fire that didn't need constant tending. The contrast between this interior and every other interior in the valley wasn't just about temperature, it was about dignity. These children were doing their schoolwork without shivering. Meg was cooking in a simple apron rather than a heavy coat. The family would sleep through the night without someone having to wake every 2 hours to feed a ravenous fire. Winter hadn't been defeated, but it had been negotiated with on terms that allowed life to continue with something approaching normalcy. Samuel looked at Margaret Hollister, the widow he'd pitied and dismissed, and spoke a sentence that transformed his understanding and would eventually transform the valleys. "We've been building wrong for 70 years, and it took a widow to show us." The words came out quiet, almost reverent, the acknowledgement of a man whose expertise had just been revealed as incomplete in ways that mattered more than pride. Meg didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The cabin's warmth spoke for itself. Samuel left an hour later, leaving the wood he'd brought as a gift, even though it clearly wasn't needed. He drove his sleigh back toward town through cold that felt even more brutal after the warmth of the Hollister cabin, and his mind was working through implications that spread like cracks through ice. If Meg was right and the evidence suggested she was, then every house in the valley was built wrong. Not poorly, not carelessly, but fundamentally wrong in ways that no amount of quality construction could fix. The revelation was both humbling and infuriating. The county extension agent, a man named Richard Davies, arrived at the Hollister homestead on January 2nd with calibrated instruments and institutional skepticism. He'd heard the rumors from Samuel Brennan, who'd made a special trip into town to find him. The story had seemed too extreme to credit, a cabin maintaining 68 degrees while burning a quarter of the wood everyone else needed. It violated everything the Extension Service had published about heating requirements for this climate. Davies had brought his tools, a calibrated mercury thermometer, an anemometer for measuring wind speed, and a notebook for recording data. He was a man of science and government bulletins, and he approached extraordinary claims with the healthy doubt of someone who'd seen enthusiasm outpace evidence many times before. But he was also honest enough to be willing to be proven wrong if the data supported it. He measured the temperature inside the cabin. 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Not 68 this time, but close enough that the minor variation only confirmed the reading's legitimacy. He measured the temperature outside, 22 degrees below zero. He took the wind reading in the open, and the cups of his anemometer spun so fast he had to shield it from gusts. 40 miles per hour, sustained with gusts pushing 50. Then he walked around to the north side of the cabin and placed the anemometer in the 10-foot space between the cabin's north wall and the south wall of the corridor structure. The cups barely turned. He watched them for a full minute, then checked the reading. 3 miles per hour, a 92% reduction in wind speed. Davies was meticulous in a way that comes from professional training. He asked to see Meg's records, and she produced a logbook she'd been keeping since October. Every day she'd recorded the outside temperature, the inside temperature, and an exact measure of wood consumed. The entries were neat, consistent, and damning to every assumption Davies had made about heating requirements. The handwriting was clearly a woman's, but the methodology was pure engineering discipline. "This isn't luck. This is applied thermodynamics." Davies had said it quietly, more to himself than to Meg, but the words carried weight. This wasn't folk wisdom or frontier improvisation. This was physics producing reproducible results, and those results were extraordinary enough to warrant documentation at a level beyond casual observation. Word spread through the valley with the speed of information that challenges fundamental assumptions. It wasn't gossip anymore, though gossip had carried it initially. It became fact verified by an institutional authority whose professional credibility was beyond question. By mid-January, when the Great Freeze finally broke and the temperature climbed back above zero for the first time in 23 days, half the valley knew that something impossible was happening at the Hollister place. The mockery evaporated. It didn't fade gradually. It stopped as if cut with a knife, replaced by a silence that was equal parts respect and discomfort. Men who'd called it the widow's folly now avoided mentioning it at all, or spoke of the Hollister place with a carefulness that suggested they were embarrassed by their previous judgment, but not quite ready to apologize for it. Daniel Cross showed up on a cold but comparatively mild day in early February. The temperature was holding at 10 above zero, which felt almost warm after the sustained siege. He rode up to the cabin alone without the presence of his wife or sister, And when Meg came out to greet him, Daniel didn't dismount immediately. He sat on his horse for a moment, his face working through expressions that suggested an internal argument not yet resolved. When he finally spoke, the words came out stiff, formal, missing the apology they should have contained, but approaching it as closely as a man like Daniel could manage. Meg, I'd like you to show me how it works. That afternoon, Meg spent 3 hours with her brother-in-law, sketching the design, explaining the principles of the air gap and the earth berm, showing him the details of construction that made the difference between a structure that worked and one that failed. She pulled out Thomas's old engineering notebooks, showed Daniel the diagrams and calculations that had guided her work. Daniel listened with the concentration of a man whose pride had been beaten down by cold and whose practical sense had finally overcome his attachment to tradition. Catherine watched from the cabin window, and when Daniel finally rode away with rolled sketches tucked into his coat, she turned to Meg with an expression that combined vindication and relief. He'll build one, and he'll tell others it works. Meg didn't look triumphant. She looked tired but satisfied the way a woman looks when a long argument has finally been settled by evidence rather than rhetoric. The valley's wood consumption that following winter, documented by the Trading Post sales records, would drop by 35% compared to the previous year. Families who'd been burning themselves into poverty were now burning sustainably. Children who'd been sick all winter with respiratory illnesses showed dramatic improvement. The doctor making his winter rounds noted a 60% reduction in cold-related ailments and started asking questions about what had changed. Meg continued to consult and she continued to refuse payment. Families would ride out to ask questions about drainage or earth berming or roof pitch, and Meg would spend afternoons sketching and explaining using Thomas's notebooks to show principles rather than just methods. Catherine became the family's illustrator, her hands steadier than Meg's, her diagrams clearer. Together, they became an informal extension service, teaching anyone who asked the principles that had transformed their brutal winter into something survivable. The valley's economy shifted in ways both obvious and subtle. The Trading Post owner, seeing his lumber sales drop, had initially worried about revenue, but then he'd noticed something interesting. The families saving money on wood were spending that money elsewhere. Coffee sales were up, sugar sales were up. Tools that people had been putting off buying were being purchased. One family bought a piano in the summer of 1921, hauling it from Cheyenne at considerable expense. The instrument represented a psychological shift as much as an economic one. They had moved beyond survival into a space where beauty and culture could be prioritized, where a child could learn music rather than simply learning to endure. Richard Davies, the extension agent, became the official documenter of what had happened. In the fall of 1920, he published Extension Service Bulletin Number 47, titled An Innovative Method for Mitigating Convective Heat Loss in Plains Homesteads. It was filled with Meg's data, Davies' own measurements and diagrams of the original structure, along with simplified variations suitable for different budgets and situations. The bulletin credited the design to Margaret Hollister, widow of civil engineer Thomas Hollister, based on principles of thermodynamics in earth structures. The bulletin was dry and technical in the way that government publications tend to be, but the data it contained was revolutionary. Families across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas received it in their mail, studied the diagrams, and began planning their own versions. Agricultural offices across the Northern Plains reprinted it. County agents brought it to farmer meetings and used it to illustrate the principle that observation and adaptation could be more valuable than tradition and stubbornness. Within a year, variations of the earth-bermed windbreak were being incorporated into new homestead construction across the region. Within 5 years, an estimated 200 Wyoming walls existed across the Northern Plains. Within a decade, the principle was standard practice recommended in building guides and taught in agricultural colleges as an example of applied thermodynamics solving real-world problems. Most of the builders who incorporated the technique into their work never knew Margaret Hollister's name. They knew it as the Wyoming method or the Northern windbreak design, a piece of frontier wisdom that had emerged from the hard experience of people who'd learned to work with nature's rules rather than fight them. Meg didn't care about the attribution. She'd never built the corridor for fame or recognition. She'd built it to keep Emma from coughing blood in the middle of the night, and by that measure, it had succeeded absolutely. But on the night of January 20th, 1920, when the town held a meeting to discuss preparations for the rest of winter, and Samuel Brennan had stood to speak, Meg had gotten the closest thing to a public apology she would receive. Samuel's voice had carried across the crowded room, and every person present had understood the weight of what he was saying. I owe Mrs. Hollister a public apology. I told her this design wouldn't work. I told her it would rot and fail. I was wrong, and more than that, we all owe her our attention because what she's built shows us that we've been approaching this problem incorrectly. Not poorly, but incorrectly. And there's a difference. Daniel Cross had stood next, his voice carrying the strain of admitting error. I told my sister's friend she was making herself a spectacle. I questioned her judgment and her fitness to raise her daughters. I was wrong about all of it. Mrs. Hollister understood something the rest of us missed, and her daughters are warm because she had the courage to build what she knew was right, despite what we all said. Even Hank Porter had been silent that night, which for a man of his temperament was concession enough. He'd sat in the back, arms crossed, face set, but he'd stayed for the whole meeting, and he'd ridden past the Hollister place on his way home and looked at that corridor with eyes that saw something different than they'd seen in autumn. The winter of 1919 to 1920 had tested every assumption the valley held about survival and had found most of them wanting. It had shown that toughness without understanding was just stubbornness wearing a different name. It had proven that the quiet observer could see truths that the loud expert missed. And it had demonstrated that sometimes what looks like a widow's madness is just engineering operating on better information than tradition possessed. Margaret Hollister had built a corridor to protect her daughters, and in doing so had changed how an entire region thought about shelter and heat and the fundamental relationship between human habitation and the relentless forces that surrounded it. The corridor still stood earthen and strange, a monument not to grief, but to the power of knowledge married to necessity and to the truth that sometimes the most unlikely person carries the most necessary answer. Spring arrived in 1920 with the tentative warmth of a season that had learned not to make promises the land might punish it for keeping. Snow melted in stages, revealing earth that looked exhausted from its months under assault. By March, mud had replaced ice as the primary obstacle to movement, and people who'd spent winter huddled by fires now ventured out to assess what had survived and what hadn't. Daniel Cross came to Meg in early April with sketches of his own making, rough drawings, showing a wall rather than a tunnel, but capturing the essential principle. His hands were stained with ink from repeated erasures and corrections, evidence of a man working through a problem he only partially understood but was determined to solve. I can't replicate what you built. Don't have the barn positioned right, and my wife would have my head if I tried digging a trench that size through her garden space. But I can build a wall, 10 feet high solid planks, 40 feet north of the cabin. Create that dead air pocket you showed me. Will it work? Meg studied the sketches with the attention of someone who understood that what she said next would determine whether her brother-in-law spent money wisely or wasted it on a structure that failed. She traced the wall's dimensions with her finger, calculated sight lines and wind patterns, using methods Thomas had taught her, and finally nodded. It'll work. Won't be as efficient of mine because you won't have the earth insulation, but you'll still cut your fuel use by a third, maybe 40%. Make sure you anchor it deep. Wind's going to push hard on a wall that tall. How deep? 3 feet minimum. 4 would be better. And brace it every 8 feet on the backside. This isn't a fence, Daniel. It's a fortification against physics. Daniel had started construction in late April, working alone because pride wouldn't let him ask for help, even as necessity drove him to adopt a widow's innovation. By June, the wall stood finished raw lumber, weathering to gray solid enough that when the wind hit it that fall, it barely trembled. The structure cost him $35 in materials and 3 weeks of labor, and it looked like exactly what it was, a practical solution, built by a man who'd learned humility from frozen fingers and empty wood piles. Word of Daniel's project spread, and with it came a cascade of variations as other families adapted the principle to their specific situations. The widow Peterson, whose husband had died 2 years prior, leaving her with a cabin and 40 acres she could barely manage alone, asked Meg if a simple fence would help. Meg had ridden out to assess her property, noted the prevailing wind patterns in the cabin's orientation, and designed something the widow could build herself with materials she could afford. 7 feet high, no need for the full 10. Anchor posts every 6 feet, horizontal boards with quarter-inch gaps to let some wind through so it doesn't just rip the whole thing down in a bad blow. Paint it or the wood won't last 5 years. Widow Peterson had built it in sections over the summer, working in early morning before heat made labor dangerous. By August, her fence stood complete crooked in places, but functional. That following winter, her wood consumption dropped enough that she stopped worrying whether she'd run out before spring, and that change alone was worth more than the fence's material cost. Samuel Brennan, whose professional expertise had been challenged by Meg's success, but whose integrity wouldn't let him ignore effective solutions, built a lean-to shed along his cabin's north wall. The structure served double duty as storage for tools and firewood, while creating the wind buffer that his years of experience had never incorporated into his designs. He didn't announce the project or make excuses for it. He simply built it, and when customers asked about the unusual placement, he showed them the principles Meg had demonstrated and suggested they consider similar approaches for their own properties. A young couple named Patterson, newly arrived in the valley with limited funds and unlimited optimism, studied Meg's design and decided to replicate it exactly. They didn't have a barn positioned correctly, so they built one placing it 40 feet north of their cabin site before constructing the cabin itself. They scrounged materials from an abandoned homestead 15 miles away, hauling scrap lumber and salvaged metal over multiple trips. Their corridor cost $95 and looked rough compared to Meg's, but it worked. That first winter, they burned less than a cord of wood per month and kept their small cabin at 65 degrees, while their neighbors marveled at their comfort and regretted not planning so carefully themselves. By the end of summer 1927, families had built windbreaks of various designs. By the following spring, that number had grown to 19. The valley's landscape was changing in ways subtle but meaningful. Cabins that had stood exposed now had walls or sheds or fences on their northern exposures. New construction incorporated wind protection from the planning stage rather than adding it as desperate afterthought. The pattern was spreading through observation and conversation. Neighbor teaching neighbor, the kind of organic dissemination that comes when innovation solves real problems people actually face. The economic effects manifested in ways both immediate and delayed. The Trading Post ledgers showed a 35% reduction in wood sales for the winter of 1920 to 1921 compared to the previous year. Families that had burned 8 to 10 cords were now burning 5 to 6. The saved money flowed into other purchases, better tools, more food variety, occasional luxuries that had been unthinkable when every spare dollar went toward fuel. One family purchased a piano in the summer of 1921, hauling it from Cheyenne at considerable expense. The instrument represented a psychological shift as much as an economic one. They had moved beyond survival into a space where beauty and culture could be prioritized, where a child could learn music rather than simply learning to endure. The piano's arrival became a community event, families gathering to hear it play the sound carrying across the prairie, as evidence that life here could be more than mere persistence against hostile forces. The broader economic implications rippled outward in ways that took time to recognize. Lumber prices stabilized at lower levels as panic demand disappeared. Men who'd been cutting wood at unsustainable rates could now work more reasonable hours, reducing injury rates and extending their productive years. The Trading Post owner, after initial concern about reduced sales, discovered that his overall revenue had actually increased as customers spent their wood savings on other goods. The economy was diversifying in small ways, becoming less dependent on the single desperate cycle of cutting and burning that had characterized previous winters. Davies's Extension Service Bulletin number 47 reached beyond the valley through channels Meg never witnessed directly. Agricultural offices across Wyoming receive copies in their monthly distribution packages. County agents in Montana and the Dakotas read it with interest that ranged from skeptical to intrigued. Some filed it away as interesting but impractical for their specific regions. Others brought it to farmer meetings and found audiences hungry for solutions to problems that had seemed intractable since settlement began. By 1921, the bulletin was being reprinted by extension services in 3 states. By 1922, mentions of windbreak thermal design began appearing in agricultural journals published out of land-grant universities. By 1923, an estimated 200 structures incorporating some version of Meg's principle existed across the northern plains, built by people who'd heard about the Wyoming method or the northern windbreak technique from neighbors or county agents or bulletin boards at rural post offices. Most builders who incorporated the design never learned Margaret Hollister's name. The technique became folkloric, attributed to no single source, but understood as wisdom that had emerged from the collective experience of people who'd survived hard winters and learned from them. Meg encountered this anonymity directly when a family passing through Wyoming in the summer of 1924 stopped to water their horses at her property. The husband noticed the corridor and asked about it with genuine curiosity. "That's one of those Wyoming walls, isn't it? Heard about those down in Colorado. Fellow told me they cut heating costs in half. You build this yourself." Meg had confirmed that she had, and the traveler had nodded with appreciation but no recognition. The man had no idea he was talking to the structure's original designer, and Meg hadn't corrected him. The technique was working its way across the landscape without need for attribution, which suited her fine. She'd never built it for recognition. She'd built it so Emma wouldn't cough blood again. The crash of 1929 and the depression that followed created conditions that vindicated Meg's approach in ways she'd never anticipated. When cash became scarce across the rural West, families with wind-protected homes had a survival advantage that proved decisive. Wood still needed to be cut, but cutting 5 cords instead of 10 meant the difference between exhausting labor that broke bodies and manageable work that could be sustained. Money saved on fuel could be diverted to food or property taxes or the 100 other expenses that threatened to sink families already operating at subsistence levels. The Civilian Conservation Corps, established in 1933 as part of Roosevelt's New Deal programs, included windbreak construction among its rural improvement projects. Young men from eastern cities arrived in Wyoming and Montana to build soil conservation structures and learn to build northern windbreaks for struggling homesteads. The CCC crews worked from standardized plans that had evolved from Davies' original bulletin, now refined through a decade of field experience and engineering analysis. Meg encountered a CC crew in the summer of 1934, working on a property 12 miles from her own. She had ridden over out of curiosity and found 6 young men in government-issue work clothes digging a foundation trench under the supervision of a foreman who looked barely older than his crew. The foreman had a blueprint spread on a makeshift table, and Meg had recognized the basic design immediately, even though the details had evolved beyond her original. The foreman had noticed Meg studying the plans and had offered to explain them with the enthusiasm of someone proud of his work. Northern Windbreak Design latest specifications from the Extension Service. "We've built 17 of these this summer. Really makes a difference for these families trying to hold on." Meg had asked to see the plans, and the foreman had handed them over without hesitation. The design showed refinements she hadn't considered: improved drainage systems, modified earth berm angles for better water shedding, standardized dimensions based on typical cabin sizes. The blueprint was stamped with an Extension Service seal, but carried no attribution to any individual designer. "You come up with these modifications yourself?" The foreman had shaken his head. "No, ma'am, these come from the university. Engineering department worked them up based on field data collected over the past 10 years or so. They say the original design came from some homesteader up in Wyoming who figured it out back around 1920, but nobody seems to know who exactly. Just know it works." Meg had handed the plans back and watched the crew work for another hour, noting their efficiency and the quality of their construction. These young men were building better versions of her original concept, and they were doing it for families who needed it most, and none of them knew or cared who'd first demonstrated the principle. The technique had escaped its origin and become something larger, and that seemed right to Meg. Truth didn't need ownership to be useful. By 1935, Wyoming's relief program was incorporating windbreak construction into its portfolio of assistance for struggling homesteads. Families could apply for materials and labor, and if approved, would receive help building structures designed to reduce their fuel consumption and improve their chances of surviving until economic conditions improved. The program drew directly from the body of knowledge that had accumulated since Meg's original corridor, but the paperwork identified the technique only as established rural building practice, documented in Extension Service publications going back to 1920. Meg herself had turned 44 by then, her dark hair showing gray at the temples, her face lined from years under Wyoming sun and wind. Catherine was 42, still managing her brother's household and keeping the detailed records that had proven so valuable when Davies had come investigating all those years ago. Emma had grown to 33, married to a rancher's son living 6 miles away with 3 children of her own. Rose was 31, married as well, teaching at the county school, and living in a small house that featured, among other modern conveniences, a windbreak wall her husband had built following principles her mother had explained. The original corridor still stood earthen and peculiar, now 16 years old, and showing no signs of the rot Samuel Brennan had confidently predicted. The logs of the cabin showed normal weathering but no moisture damage. The roof seams remained watertight. The earth berm had grown a thick covering of prairie grass that held the soil in place through spring runoff and summer storms. If anything, the structure had become more effective over time as the earth settled and compacted, creating an increasingly stable thermal mass that buffered the cabin's interior from temperature extremes in both winter and summer. Visitors occasionally arrived, people who'd heard about the original Wyoming wall and wanted to see it for themselves. Meg would show them through answer questions sketch modifications suitable for their specific situations. She never charged for her time or expertise. Catherine would sometimes offer coffee to travelers who'd come long distances, and conversations would stretch into afternoons as Meg explained principles of convective heat loss and thermal mass to ranchers and farmers who'd never heard those terms but understood cold and fuel scarcity intimately. The Second World War brought new pressures and new validations. Material shortages made fuel conservation critical, and families with windbreak-protected homes weathered rationing better than those still heating conventionally. Lumber became scarce for civilian use as mills shifted production to military needs. Coal was diverted to factories. The families who'd built wind protection in previous years found themselves with an advantage that proved valuable when adaptation became difficult. Meg aged through those years without fanfare. Her daughters gave her grandchildren who visited and played in the corridor that had started everything, treating it as a cave for their adventures, unaware that it represented anything more significant than a covered walkway between buildings. Catherine maintained the logbooks, now 25 years of continuous data showing temperatures and fuel consumption across every season, a research data set more comprehensive than most academic studies could claim. In 1948, a young journalist from the Cheyenne Tribune named David Fisher discovered Davies's old bulletin while researching a feature story about Depression-era rural innovations. The bulletin's data intrigued him, and he started tracking the source backward through Extension Service archives and county records. The trail led him to Margaret Hollister, now 57 years old and still living in the original cabin, still using the corridor daily, still consulting occasionally for neighbors who wanted advice on their own projects. Fisher drove out on a bright June morning, his notepad ready and his expectations uncertain. He'd seen plenty of rural innovations that looked impressive on paper, but failed to deliver in practice. But when he arrived and saw the corridor and talked to Meg and Catherine, and reviewed the logbooks and did the arithmetic on fuel savings compounded over 29 years, He understood he'd found something genuinely significant. The interview lasted 3 hours. Fisher asked about motivation, about design process, about community reaction. Meg answered with the plain language of someone describing facts rather than seeking admiration. When Fisher asked if she felt proud of having invented a technique that had spread across multiple states and helped thousands of families, Meg had stood and walked to the window looking out at the prairie that stretched away toward horizons unchanged since she'd first arrived 30 years ago. I didn't invent anything. My husband understood these principles from his engineering work. I just had to be willing to learn from him even after he was gone. The earth knows how to stay warm. The wind knows how to steal heat. All I did was pay attention to what Thomas taught me and build accordingly. Fisher had written down the words verbatim, recognizing them as the kind of quote that captures a philosophy in a sentence. The article ran in the Tribune in August 1948 under the headline, "The Widow Who Taught Wyoming to Step Out of the Wind." It was picked up by regional papers across the Mountain West and ran in abbreviated form in farming journals as far east as Nebraska and as far west as Oregon. The article brought brief attention. A few more visitors, a letter from a professor at the University of Wyoming asking if Meg would be willing to let engineering students study the corridor as part of a thermodynamics course. Meg agreed to the latter but generally avoided the former when possible. Fame was uncomfortable for her, carrying an obligation she didn't want, and credit she felt belonged to Thomas as much as to her. Catherine, now 56 and graying but still sharp in mind and memory, had a different perspective. She'd been there for the brutal first winter, for the mockery, for the vindication, for all of it. When a visitor asked her how it felt to know her friend had changed, how people built homes across the northern plains, her answer carried weight that Meg's humility wouldn't allow her to express. She saved her daughters. She saved them from coughing themselves sick every winter, from freezing in their beds, from growing up thinking that survival meant constant misery. Everything else, all the other families in the Bulletin, in the CCCC, building these for people who need them, that's wonderful. But for Meg, it was always about Emma and Rose sleeping warm. Everything else is just grace we never expected, but are grateful for anyway. Meg died in 1968 at the age of 77, peacefully in her sleep during a mild spring night. Catherine followed 4 years later in 1972, dying at 80 in the same house she'd shared with her brother for most of her life. Emma and Rose inherited their mother's property and preserved it, understanding that the corridor represented something beyond its practical function. It was history made physical, a structure that had emerged from necessity and grown into significance without ever seeking to be more than a solution to a specific problem. The Wyoming Historical Society conducted a survey of significant rural structures in 1982 and identified the Hollister Corridor as a site worthy of preservation. The surveyor who documented it was a young woman named Elizabeth Warner, a graduate student working on her thesis about vernacular architecture of the Northern Plains. She spent 2 weeks measuring and photographing, interviewing Emma and Rose, who were now 70 and 68 respectively, reviewing Catherine's logbooks, which had been preserved in a trunk in Emma's attic. The data impressed her more than the structure itself. 29 continuous years of temperature and fuel consumption records meticulously maintained represented a longitudinal study more rigorous than most academic research. She incorporated it into her thesis, which later became a published monograph titled Thermal Efficiency in Frontier Architecture, Case Studies from Wyoming 1900 to 1950. The property was designated a Wyoming Historical Site in 1985. A simple bronze plaque was installed near the corridor's entrance, text approved by Emma and Rose, who'd insisted on simplicity over elaboration. The plaque read, "Margaret Hollister Wind Shelter, 1919. You don't fight the Wyoming wind, you intelligently step out of its way." Thomas Hollister, civil engineer, is remembered by his widow, Margaret. Tourists began arriving in small numbers, people interested in frontier history or vernacular architecture, or simply curious about a structure that had outlasted so many supposedly superior modern buildings. The corridor still stood, now 66 years old, its earth berm thick with grass, its wooden frame showing age but not failure, its metal roof weathered but intact. It had survived longer than the original cabin's roof, longer than several supposedly permanent buildings in the nearby town, longer than most of the people who'd once mocked it as a widow's delusion. The irony wasn't lost on the few people who remembered the early days. Samuel Brennan's sawmill had closed in 1947, the building eventually succumbing to rot that Brennan had once predicted would destroy Meg's work. Hank Porter's ranch had been sold in 1952, the main house having suffered foundation damage from frost heave that might have been prevented with better wind protection. Daniel Cross's simpler wall had lasted until 1969 before needing complete replacement, having served well but not been built with the same attention to drainage and durability that Meg had incorporated into her design. The original corridor endured because it had been built correctly from first principles. Meg had understood materials and forces and had designed accordingly. She hadn't been lucky, she'd been rigorous. The academic world discovered Meg's work in waves, each generation finding it anew through different lenses. In the 1960s, building science researchers studying integrated thermal envelope design encountered references to the Wyoming windbreak technique in older literature and traced it backward to Davies's bulletin and eventually to Meg's original structure. They recognized it as an early application of principles that were only being formalized in contemporary building codes. A 1973 paper published in the Journal of Thermal Engineering referenced the Hollister corridor as a case study in passive wind mitigation, noting that its fuel efficiency metrics remained impressive even by modern standards. A 1981 dissertation from Montana State University on frontier innovation devoted an entire chapter to Meg's design, analyzing it through the framework of knowledge transfer in isolated communities. None of this academic attention changed the essential fact that Meg had built a corridor to keep her daughters warm, and it had worked, and that success had propagated through observation and necessity rather than through formal channels or institutional blessing. The technique had spread because it solved problems, not because authorities had endorsed it. The endorsement came later after the evidence was already overwhelming. Emma died in 1989 at 77, the same age her mother had reached. Rose followed in 1995 at 81. Their children inherited the property and continued the preservation, understanding that they were maintaining not just a structure, but a story about observation and adaptation and the difference between tradition and truth. The modern era brought new appreciation for old wisdom. As energy costs rose and environmental concerns made efficiency valuable beyond mere economics, architects and builders started looking backward at vernacular solutions that had been dismissed as primitive. The Wyoming windbreak technique, along with earth berming and passive thermal mass, moved from historical curiosity to active practice. New homes across the northern plains began incorporating wind protection as standard design elements. Not crude walls or emergency measures, but carefully planned landscape features and structural orientations that worked with prevailing winds rather than against them. The principle Meg had demonstrated in 1919 became part of the design vocabulary taught in architectural programs, usually without attribution, but occasionally with a footnote mentioning the Hollister corridor as an early example. In 2015, the University of Wyoming's College of Engineering conducted a detailed thermal analysis of the original corridor using modern instrumentation. They measured heat flux through walls, air infiltration rates, thermal mass effectiveness, everything Meg had understood intuitively but never quantified beyond her simple logbook entries. The results confirmed what 96 years of functional success had already demonstrated: the design worked exactly as Meg had intended and worked with efficiency that modern materials could improve but not fundamentally surpass. The lead researcher on that project, a professor named Jennifer Martinez, stood in the corridor during a winter measurement session and felt the profound stillness Meg had created all those decades ago. Outside, wind was blowing at 35 miles per hour in temperatures well below zero. Inside the corridor, the air barely moved and the temperature held steady at 40 degrees, far warmer than the external conditions, and stable enough to make the cabin's heating task manageable rather than desperate. She turned to her graduate students and offered an observation that would have pleased Meg in its directness. This is what happens when you understand the problem correctly. She wasn't trying to heat the outdoors. She was trying to stop the wind from making heating the indoors impossible. Different problem, different solution, and a solution that still works a century later. The quarter stands today now over a century old, maintained by great-grandchildren of Meg and Catherine, who understand its significance without needing to exaggerate it. It's a structure that solved a problem through observation and adaptation, that spread through demonstration rather than promotion, that endured because it was built on understanding rather than assumption. Visitors still arrive, though, in smaller numbers as frontier history becomes more distant and less immediately relevant to modern concerns. The plaque still bears those words about stepping out of the wind's way, a statement of philosophy as much as engineering. The earth berm still holds thick grass. The wooden frame still stands. The metal roof still sheds snow and rain. The corridor still creates the pocket of still air that makes the difference between fighting winter and living through it. The prairie wind still blows from the north, relentless and cold when the season turns. It hits the corridor and flows over and around it, never reaching the cabin that shelters behind it. The cabin stays warmer than it should, defying the odds that geography and climate seem to dictate. Not through magic or luck, but through the application of simple principles observed and implemented by a woman who'd learned that nature doesn't negotiate but will work with those who understand its rules. The legacy isn't in fame or recognition. Meg never wanted those and never received them in proportion to her contribution. The legacy is in warm children sleeping through winter nights in families who burn half the wood they otherwise would in the quiet propagation of useful knowledge through communities that needed it. The legacy is in every windbreak wall, every earth berm structure, every building designed with awareness that wind is the enemy and still air is the shield. The Wyoming Historical Society updated the site's interpretive materials in 2019 for the quarter's centennial. They added context about the winter of 1919 to 1920, about the spread of the technique, about the economic and human impacts of a single good idea all implemented correctly. They quoted Catherine's observation about grace. They included excerpts from the logbooks showing 29 years of data. They showed photographs of similar structures across multiple states, a visual map of an idea's propagation. But the most effective interpretation remained the corridor itself. Standing inside it on a winter day, when the wind screams across the prairie, feeling the stillness, Meg created. Understanding viscerally why this worked when conventional approaches failed, that physical experience taught more than any plaque or pamphlet could convey. The truth about fighting nature is that you can't win through strength. You win through understanding. You observe what is not what you want to be true. You adapt based on evidence, not tradition. You build for function rather than appearance. You accept that being called a mad widow by people who freeze is better than being called prudent by people at your funeral. Margaret Hollister understood these things because she'd watched her daughter cough blood from cold a supposedly sound cabin couldn't prevent. She learned that the natural world operated on principles that didn't care about human pride or conventional wisdom. She'd applied that learning to a specific problem, and in solving it, had created something that outlasted her and helped thousands of people she would never meet. The corridor stands as testament not to one woman's genius, but to the power of observation married to necessity of humility, partnered with determination of the quiet truth that sometimes the widow's folly is the wise person's path, and the difference between them is just a matter of surviving long enough to prove it.